In this video, we're going to be taking a sort of retro look at two cameras that came out in the last decade. Hey guys, this is Kevin for Pixovert.com. The D610 for Nikon and the Sony A7 II. They're sort of fairly iconic. This is going to be a bit more of an analytical comparison. We do a lot of creative stuff on this channel, but sometimes we do some analytical stuff as well. So if you're here for the creative stuff, maybe you'll not give this video a miss. We're going to be going into some stats and some specs. And hopefully by looking at what was happening 6-7 years ago when these two cameras came out, we can get some idea of how the camera business has evolved during the last decade. Now, the Nikon D610 and the Sony A7 II came out at around the same time. They were both of them updates to releases that had come out shortly before. The Nikon D600 was very similar to the D610. There were very few differences. And the Sony A7 II had one very significant update from the Sony A7 Mark I. We're going to be discussing this in a bit more detail. But before we carry on, I just want to have one disclaimer. I'm going to be talking quite a lot of stats and specs, and I've tried to make sure everything is nice and accurate. But if you notice anything which is off, do leave a comment in the description letting me know. And finally, we're going to be talking prices as well. Both of these cameras are still available in most markets. And we're going to be talking March 2020 prices. So those will change over time. Now, the D610 is obviously one of the DSLRs from Nikon, and the Sony A7 II is a mirrorless camera. One of the big differences between DSLRs and mirrorless cameras is obviously that the mirrorless cameras tend to be a lot smaller. The Sony A7 II was an upgrade to a much smaller version. The Sony A7 Mark I was about 30% smaller than the A7 II, and part of the reason why Sony produced the A7 I the way they did was to make it the smallest full frame camera that had ever been produced. So it had that one record-breaking feature. When the Sony A7 II came out, it had this one significant upgrade. It had in-body image stabilization, and that was the big selling point for the Sony A7 II. How Sony managed to put image stabilization in such a small body is still a bit of a wonder. I don't think anyone else has really managed that. Now, when we look at the comparison between the Sony A7 II and the D610, we're looking at competition between two of the three main camera producers over the last decade. And one thing to bear in mind is that Sony gradually came from third place to overtake both Nikon, and I think now they've overtaken Canon as well. So when we look at this comparison, we maybe get an idea of how that transition took place. Now, the Sony A7 II does not have a top monitor. It's a much smaller body, and a common feature with the smaller full-frame cameras is that they don't have this top LCD display. But what they do have, they have a tilt screen. This means that you can view the monitor from different angles, and in some ways this compensates for not having the top LCD display. Now, when we look at the raw details, the cameras, both of them on DxO, score very highly in terms of the camera sensor scores. The Nikon has 94, whilst the Sony A7 II has a score of 90. These two cameras almost certainly have got the same sensor inside of them. Sony do make sensors for Nikon as well as for their own cameras. And when we go down and look at the bits per pixel on DxOMark, we can see that Sony has 12 bits per pixel, whilst Nikon has 14 bits per pixel. I can't make any sense of this because both of them are 14 bits per pixel. So I'm not sure why DxO is showing this different result, but almost certainly they have the same sensor. And if we go and look at the measurements, we can see that in terms of tonal range, Both cameras have more or less identical scores. Dynamic range, again, both the Sony and the Nikon have very similar scores, with the Nikon just pulling away left hand side there. We can also see the signal to noise ratio. Once again, very, very similar. These are almost certainly the same sensor and giving very similar results. As I said before, the Sony is significantly smaller than the Nikon. And when it first came out, it had a significantly lower price, about $1,600, whilst the Nikon D610 was about $2,000. Now, both of them were priced at entry-level prices. They were priced both for the enthusiastic amateur or the professional photographer. The Sony was significantly cheaper, and it was the only one that had this feature of in-body image stabilization, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's remained very, very popular. The D610 did not have the feature of in-body image stabilization, but it does come with a very large range of lenses, some of which are vibration reduced. These are the so-called VR lenses from Nikon, and these will have optical image stabilization within the lens. And I think this compensates to some significant extent for the lack of in-body image stabilization. In actual fact, the Nikon D610 has almost as many vibration reduced lenses as there are lenses in the entire Sony A7 lineup. Nikon's camera belongs to the F mount, and it has about 100 lenses that you can go out and buy right now. The Sony belongs to the E mount, and that has about 30 lenses that you can go out and buy right now. Obviously, there are third-party lenses that you can also get, but also for the Sony camera, it has a much smaller back flange distance, 18 millimeters compared to 46 millimeters for the Nikon D610, and that means you can get quite a lot of adapters that allow you to use different manufacturers' lenses with the Sony. Not so much with the Nikon camera, but then again, you probably don't need to adapt too many lenses for use with the Nikon camera, because Nikon has got a very wide range of lenses. Sony came out with a couple of adapters that allow you to use lenses from the DSLR full frame lens lineup that Sony had and still has. These adapters, they're quite expensive, allow you to use the lenses from the Sony full frame DSLR cameras, and they give you the same kind of performance as if you were using the lenses on the native DSLR cameras. So that increases the number of lenses that the Sony has, but overall Nikon has a much wider range of lenses, and particularly they also have specialty lenses that Sony simply do not have. Now, both cameras have got a 24 megapixel sensor. They both use contrast autofocus, phase detect autofocus. Whilst Nikon have face autofocus, Sony have eye autofocus. And the eye autofocus on the A7 II was, I believe, the first time that Sony were using eye autofocus. It's a single shot autofocus, which means you can't use it in continuous mode. Now, the IAF on the Sony camera is arguably a lot more useful than the face AF on the Nikon D610. And in actual fact, Sony went on to develop continuous IAF, and nowadays they have real-time eye autofocus, and that's something that has really been very popular and probably one of the reasons that Sony has come to dominate in the full frame camera market, because the IAF is just a killer function inside of the camera. Both of the cameras have 1080p, whilst the Sony has 60 frames per second. The Nikon has 30 frames per second. And another feature I've already mentioned is the tilt screen. Nikon has got a fixed screen, although it does have the two screens. The Nikon has the advantage of 2 card slots. Frames per second, both of them are about the same. 6 frames per second for Nikon, 5 for Sony. And both of them, I think, are best regarded as being weather resistant rather than weather sealed. Now, the biggest difference, I would say, is the lens count. Nikon's lens count at 100, pretty significant. Probably gives you everything you would want, amateur or professional. Sony have got very good lenses, but there is a much smaller lens count, and you may feel the shoe pinching if you need to get a specialty lens for the Sony lineup, and you may feel the shoe pinching if you need to use specialty lenses for the Sony camera. Now both cameras are selling for around $900. The Nikon camera has fallen to that price quite recently. Not sure why the price has fallen quite significantly. It may be that the camera is end of line, or it may be that Nikon are just having a really nice sale. But whatever is going on, the price right now looks pretty sweet for both of the cameras. Now, if we take a quick look at what happened after the Sony A7 II came out, we can see with the Sony A7 III, we get that continuous eye autofocus. We get 4K and we get touchscreen on the Sony device. We also get two card slots, and a much faster frames per second. So those are the things that I think have helped to make Sony really successful. If you wanted to buy the A7 III, you're going to be paying about twice as much as for the A7 II. And obviously people are paying quite a lot for that 4K and that touchscreen. It's still a 24 megapixel sensor.